Sveiki, Europietiškos dešinės podcast'o klausytojai. Tik tai noriu trumpai informuoti, kad šiandien mūsų svečiuose bus daktaras Benjaminas Tallis ir tolimesnis podcastas vyks anglų kalba. So, hello, dear listeners, and today in our podcast, you will hear Dr. Benjaminu Tallisu. He is a senior research fellow of the Alfred von Oppenheim Center for the Future of Europe at the German Council on Foreign Relations. He previously worked for the EU on security missions in Ukraine and the Balkans and was a policy officer at the European Center of Excellence for Civilian Crisis Management in Berlin. Benjaminu Tallisu holds a doctorate from the University of Manchester. He is the author of the books To Ukraine with Love, Essays on Russia's War and Europe's Future, which was published in 2022, and Identities, Borderscapes, Orders, Insecurity, Immobility, and Crisis in the EU and Ukraine, which was published this year. So I'll call you Ben, okay? Because we've met already in the summer when we had the NAFO summit in Vilnius, and it's really nice. It's really nice to see you back in Vilnius. I think, well, maybe compared to the summer, we're all a little bit less optimistic on how the Ukrainian war effort is going, but I think there's also more skepticism in terms of how, politicians in the West, in general, the EU and NATO, how they see the situation, how they see their commitment to, on the one hand, supporting Ukraine, aiming at Ukrainian victory, but also another issue maybe is identifying a more clear vision of what we want in geopolitics, in security, in protecting democratic and liberal values in the future. And one of the topics could be, how would you assess, for example, what was Zeitenwende in Germany, which was started with a lot of pathos and, saying this is the turning point. We are now changing how, Germany looks at its security of its allies. And of course, the relationship with Lithuania is very, very important here because Germany has promised to send a military brigade to be stationed in Lithuania and to be not only stationed, but ready for action. And it's apparently already causing various different problems and disputes in Germany. So, how do you see Zeitenwende and how is it going? Is it going? What needs to change to make it happen? What are your views here?
Well, Laurinus, first of all, thanks for having me. Svikem to everyone out there, or labas vakas. It's really great to be back in Lithuania. My heart rose as I actually came out of the airport on the way into the city because I had such a good time here in the summer at the NAFO summit. Then I was here for the NATO summit as well, which was less of a good time because of the result that came from the decision about how, or in fact not to invite Ukraine further down the membership track. And I think it's the consequences of that decision that we're actually seeing now to a significant extent in terms of the pessimism that you mentioned, because there had been a series of strong announcements, strong support for Ukraine, and it was building up a momentum of integration and embrace of Ukraine. We'd seen stronger weapon systems being delivered. This would have been the institutional capping on that would have really, I think, cemented that Western support that Ukraine needs to win. And it is, let's remind everyone very clearly, it is in all of our interest that Ukraine does win. And that means getting Russia out of Ukraine, restoring control of its 1991 borders. But what you've rightly pointed to is that we are in a more pessimistic situation now, but I can't help but think a lot of this is manufactured fatigue, manufactured pessimism by some politicians in the West, including in Germany, it must be said, particularly with the Chancellery, who don't want to see that victory happen. It's too much of a shock, too much of a change to the international system would come from that. They would be forced to choose sides. It would really spur on this systemic competition between democracies, as you mentioned, and autocracies. And so when you ask then about the Zeitenwende in Germany, and I'm sure we'll come back to this more, I think of Mahatma Gandhi's comment when asked about Western civilization, and he said, I think it would be a good idea. And so the Zeitenwende is a little bit similar at the moment. Progress has been made. There has been change. Germany is moving, but it's very unclear to many of its partners where it's going. And so there's a lot of unfinished business of that Zeitenwende. But just to perhaps also flag up something for further in our conversation, we have had good news also in the last couple of days. The decision of the European Commission to recommend that membership talks with Ukraine do actually commence. So from the disappointment of Vilnius in the summer of the NATO summit, we now see a decision that could actually have another track for Ukraine to be institutionally integrated with the West. There's a long way to go on that too, but this is a good step.
And also joining us in the studio this evening or this morning or on this day, whenever you're listening or during the night, I hope it's during the night, is Dovydas Karolskis, who is sort of a fixture on this podcast and will be the sort of sharing his remarks on whatever Benjamin says.
Thank you. I'm having pleasure to be with this sloppy voice tonight, and I will add up something in the next few minutes. But initially, I would like to answer something about those news on Ukrainian situation and joining and prospects of joining EU, because it's still not moving. It's like a new thing for the future, but how it will change the current epoch and current status on European level, what you are seeing as nearest prospects.
I think it's interesting to look at who's driving the push for Ukrainian membership, and that's the Central East European states, but it's also the European Commission. It's being less enthusiastically embraced by Germany and by some of the other older member states. In Berlin, when we talk about this, the first thing you will hear from most officials, including those who are in charge of the process from the German side, you hear about all the problems. You hear about all the obstacles, about how terribly difficult it's going to be. And I think that's really the wrong way of looking at this. Having Ukraine in the European Union is the geopolitical opportunity of a generation. It's a way to reboot European integration. It's put enlargement back on the table. And the EU, for me, is a little bit like a tuna. If it stops swimming, it dies. And Ukraine has got us swimming again. So I think we should be thankful for that, first and foremost. Secondly, the other issue, I think, is to do with reform, institutional reform, which Germany, above all other countries, is saying needs to come first before, or needs to come at the same time as Ukraine joining. I think that's a bit of a false argument, to be honest. They're trying to push an agenda that they've had for a long time anyway and combine it with this. The EU could function in the way it has now, in the institutional setup it has now with Ukraine in. Special arrangements can be made, transitional arrangements can be made. And I think we really run a big risk by trying to tie these two things together, because we know Central East European countries, but also Northern European countries, are quite nervous about treaty reform. They don't want often QMV, qualified majority voting on foreign policy, for example. Having seen the record of Germany and others in the last 10 years on major geopolitical and geoeconomic decisions, I can really understand why. This is the kind of thing that would have made the Nord Stream thing impossible at an EU level, for example. So I think there's a lot of the old reluctance is still there, but if we talk about where a Zeitenwende has actually happened, it happened in the European Commission, and it happened with Ursula von der Leyen in particular, who I think embraced this new geopolitical moment in that famous statement back on the 27th of February last year, same day as Scholz's Zeitenwende speech. But when von der Leyen said about Ukraine, they're one of us and they belong with us. And that was a sea change. That really was a change in policy. I've worked on EU-Ukraine policy for nearly 20 years, and I'd never heard something like that from such a leading figure. pushing that through has been difficult. We had to overcome the objections of Berlin, but also of Paris. However, from Paris, we have seen a bit of a change as well. The shift that Emmanuel Macron heralded in Bratislava at the Globsec conference when he talked about a rapprochement with Central and Eastern Europe, backing up Ukraine's membership aspirations for both NATO and the EU is going to be central to actually convincing Central and Eastern Europeans that he's serious about that. So I think we can expect Paris to get behind this firmly. It is unfortunately Berlin that will be one of the major obstacles to pushing this through.
Well, another thing I would like to point out is that when we are talking critically about Germany, I think we must not forget that there's a lot of criticism inside. If you read the German press, Spiel and whatnot, there's a lot of criticism on the sort of geopolitical and international relation decisions that were made in the past and sometimes are made right now. But also what I want to stress is that what we are doing is not so-called German bashing. It's exactly the opposite. Everyone, I think, still in this Central and Eastern Europe are not only looking skeptically towards Berlin, but also with an expectation, well, if you are the leaders, you should act like leaders. You should, sort of embrace the role of leadership, but not only be more like, we're leaders, but when it comes to saying no, but when it comes to doing something positive or making an impact, then it gets more problematic. So it's also, I think, an enhanced expectation towards what Germany should become as a European leader.
I think you're completely right. And this expectation comes from knowing what a positive difference a fully committed Germany would make. I mean, still the largest country in the EU, the largest economy in the EU by far. Having Germany really throw all of its weight behind these causes would make a world of difference. And so that realization, I think, is key to driving the criticism that is there, because the gap between that possibility and reality as we currently see it is so large. And you're also absolutely right that these criticisms are voiced within Germany as well. Now, I think that the time of the Zeitenwende, that initial epochal shift that Olaf Scholz talked about, is over. So that Zeitenwende is over. But there is so much unfinished business of the Zeitenwende. And what I think truly represents the biggest progress somehow is the ability to have those discussions, the ability to have those debates within Germany. So it's impressive that Germany did send weapons to Ukraine. We can say it's too slow, we can say it's not enough, but it did make that change. But the bigger change is in the internal debate. This has opened up new horizons and new possibilities. And we've seen that across all fields, from what Germany's military role is to how from where Germany gets its energy. We've even seen the nuclear debate opened up again in a way that it hasn't been for years after the so-called Energiewende, where they ditched nuclear power. There's big discussion about trade and about how dependence on China affects the country, for example. And there's really questioning there of, does the government in the current structures represent the people? Are their interests really aligned? Or is the German government, particularly the Chancellery, making policy for big business? So that's a huge change. And so all of that's being debated inside and outside Germany. And the last thing I'd say on that is that it's fun. It's sad and funny at the same time to see how Scholz called so much attention to himself with the Zeitenwende speech, and then seems to resent that attention being given when everybody's actually now debating this.
Yeah, well, I think it also ties in the question with Zeitenwende more generally to a broader sort of historical political question of the European project being aimed for what Kant called the eternal peace. Well, first of all, Kant was a little bit ironic because the quote is from a graveyard that he takes, like the eternal peace is a graveyard. Well, but he offers then an alternative. But I think there was a sort of illusion that we could have not only peace in Europe through democracy, trade, and relations, but we also could have lasting peace and stability with autocratic regimes such as Russia, China, and others who are sort of in in the sphere of influence or tightly connected with Russia or China. So I think that, would you agree that slowly that illusion is eroding? Because returning to Kant, what he said, if we want eternal peace, as he describes it, well, there should be international law, the idea of international law, that everyone follows certain rules as in a social contract inside a republic. So, if we want to have peace, we need rules. We need people committed to holding up those rules and protecting them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, going from Kant to Thomas Masaryk, I think it was Masaryk who said this, who said, what is Europe but a laboratory built on top of a graveyard? And so coming to your Kant quote, I think that's quite apt. It's what you do with that, with those ideas of republican government or democratic government that Kant talked about as a precondition for this, which in his view would mean that because there was democratic control over armed forces and the use of force, it would be too costly for citizens to go and fight each other. That has been a governing logic of German policy. And we've seen different visions and versions of this. The worst aspect of it was the sort of misguided view, the easy, lazy reading of the end of history that came out through the convergence wager, as it's known, whereby liberal economics will inevitably, automatically spread liberal politics, what's known in German as Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade. But it's interesting also to note that when Angela Merkel was speaking last year, she basically admitted there had been no real effort to change. So this was just about the handle, about the trade. And without the pressure for the vandal, you end up getting handled yourself. And we've said there has been change through trade, but the change came on the German side through the influence that was piped in from Russia and from elsewhere. And so what I think this has done is to expose some of the naiveties that were there, but to really then show how extraordinary the achievement of prior European integration to that, of transforming structural conflict, particularly between Germany and France, into structured cooperation via mutual interference, via mutual knowledge, via the kind of interaction that can take the danger out of difference, to show how extraordinary that really was. And I think that's a lesson we should actually be able to take, is we should have carried on spreading that model rather than relying on the lazy version of this. That means standing up for your values. It means being true to them at home. It means enforcing them abroad, or having a way to insist on them abroad. And we simply didn't do that with the authoritarian regimes we're dealing with. Anyone who said engagement with China has failed, well, sorry, we never tried engagement with China in a serious way. We've been on the receiving end of Chinese mercantilism, and our companies happily took the fat profits from that. That's not engagement. It's not change through trade. It's something very different. So we have to be conscious, I think, of we have to beware of being naive, but we also have to beware of drawing the wrong conclusions from this. That kind of thing could be worth trying if we actually stood up properly for our values.
Dovydas.
Yeah, so while speaking about China or Russia and having that kind of hope of reaching some kind of consensus towards some fields or mercantilic deals, I believe that we should await for something like a common basis of values. While we are talking about things like energy sector and things like that, which is really important for next 20, 30 years at least, we should expect that Russians would be understanding that they are dealing within that cage, which was introduced by Laurynas as the common project for peace. So how we should move towards that? What should be the steps towards and how we should grant those basic consensuses?
It's very kind of you to ask me a question that allows me to talk about neo-idealism, because I think that's the way to go and do this. And I think it has three pillars. Defending liberal democracy and liberal values, renewing liberal democracy and liberal values, and spreading liberal democracy and liberal values. And the first part about defending is we have to be very clear. When we're not dealing with those who are our friends, when we're dealing with states or societies that have goals directly opposed to ours and values that are contradictory to ours, we have to be ready to defend ourselves against the attacks they will have on us in numerous ways, be that military attacks, be it hybrid destabilization, or be it trying to undermine us by trying to show all of our weaknesses and working in the cracks in our societies. And so to arm ourselves to defend our values, we need the military capabilities that are there. That's going to take money and investment, but we also need the mindset to be ready to use them, mainly so that we then don't have to. This is what deterrence is actually about and how deterrence works. But I think more than that, we need to arm ourselves with the arguments that bring our populations with us to actually do that and make them willing participants in those processes. And that comes to the second part, which is about renewing liberal democracy. We have made many cracks in our own societies, and that's where Russia and other malign actors work, in the divisions that are between us, with people who have been left behind, be that economically, politically, who feel disenfranchised and dissatisfied. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that some of our economic models over the last 20 years haven't helped with that. The lack of faith in progress in many democracies, the idea that your kids can live better than you, the idea that tomorrow can be better than today in material terms as well as social terms, is not common. I mean, recently 4 out of 5 Americans surveyed said that they thought their kids would live worse than they did, than they live now. That's a story we have to change. We have to give people that meaningful hope of progress in the future, in order to have a stake in a future that is democratic. And I think, moreover, we have to show that democracy has the material edge, the material advantage, as well as the moral advantage. So we have to make ourselves really the beacons that we often claim to be in every sense, be that upholding our values, including populations, stopping societal division, but also economically and materially. It's also the only way we're going to actually solve the green transition. There's money that needs to be put into that. There's technological embrace that needs to be happen for that. And if we do that in a way that excludes too many of our people, I don't think we have a future, because they won't buy into it. People will have to sacrifice for this, but it has to be seen as an investment in a brighter future. The last part is about spreading liberal democracy. And for me, this is where we've probably learned a lot. Well, it's one of the many areas we've learned a lot in the last 20 years about how not to do it. So don't go and impose democracy at gunpoint on people who don't want it. People have to show the willingness to fight for democracy themselves, show there's an organic development of that. Neo-idealism instead would look to defend democracy where it's threatened, to give it a chance to thrive, and to become that attractive beacon, as I say, that would then attract others to show this is the best way to be. What it does create are then grey zones between our friends who we trade with more. So friendshoring is something I would definitely bring into this conversation. And our enemies, let's call them what they are, the enemies of freedom, the enemies of democracy, who we try to trade with as little as possible and who we defend ourselves against. Now, there's many countries that don't fall into either of those categories. So how do we manage relations with them is a key question on this going forward, I think.
May I provoke you a bit?
Please.
So how it differs from sort of Fukuyama's dream about global democratization and spread of liberal democracy?
Yeah, I think one of the main differences is I don't believe in any kind of teleological or automatic version of progress. Progress is something you have to fight for and struggle for at every turn. You have to give meaning and substance to the claim that liberal democracy is a better system in all ways, politically, morally, materially. And I don't think that's what Fukuyama got right. This is not something inevitable. There will be backwashes. People will come up with alternatives as well. And if alternatives are better, then we should think about what to do with them. I don't think there are better alternatives yet, but I think it's about getting away from that lazy reading of the end of history that is the crucial difference. The other part is that we have to be tougher about defending it, and we have to not just assume that actually our economics go hand in hand with our politics. Sometimes they can be opposed to each other, the interests that come from those two things. And that's something we've learned from the trading models of neoliberal globalization, I think.
Now, the point where I would strongly agree with you that the problem is very often when in politics we introduce philosophy of history, and usually historians know the philosophy of history is mainly BS, because usually philosophers, they don't know, jack what they're talking about. It's usually more of a dreamt up version of history than anything that has to do with reality. And so I think even when we look at revolutions or, utopian movements, the French Revolution, a lot of things that happened in the 19th century and the 20th century, when things were backed by a philosophy of history that, we are moving towards a revolution inevitably, and you can either join or oppose it. And historians would say, what are you talking about? There's no such thing but this determinism, is sort of hypnotic. It's like you look into an eyes of a cobra and it sort of entices you into the whole game. But I think the same thing probably happened with in the 90s, Fukuyama, he didn't invent the idea. It was he gave sort of a vocabulary for it, a Hegelian vocabulary for it, the more dangerous version of it. But it was in the air, and that there is progress but the progress is automatic, not something that we should create with a will to do so. And I think it's also got to do a lot of things with moral autonomy as a broader question in society and in politics. If we view ourselves as agents who have to create a reality or enforce a reality, it's completely different than we see ourselves only subjects who are, or objects more, who are just floating down the stream of history in a quasi sort of natural sense. So that's a very dangerous notion, just this letting go and going with the flow. But on the point that you raised with when we talk about trade and interaction and the dishonest interaction that we had with Russia and China, that we had trade, we gave them technologies, intellectual properties, but they did not transform as a response for that, for all the things that they got from the West. But there's still another question that I would like to add to that, is the corruption that came with it for Western liberal institutions. And I think we clearly saw that at the beginning of the war of Russia against Ukraine, that how many politicians, how many academical institutions and intellectual institutions were absolutely morally bankrupt.
Oh, absolutely right. Let me pick up first on your comments about history, because I find this fascinating as well. There's a wonderful joke at some point. They say, why did the leaders in the communist time stand up at the end of their own speech and applaud? Because they were merely the conduits of history. Right, and so they applaud themselves just as these conduits of history. And exactly it's that. Whatever the teleology is, there is no teleology. And this is really dangerous politics to think it is. It gives us a false sense of security that we just lie back and let this happen. I have the same feeling anytime anyone uses the phrase, the arc of history bends towards justice. No, we have fought tooth and nail for that progress, for that justice. Same thing with being on the right side of history. There is no right side of history. There's a right side of politics. And there's a right side of morality. There is no right side of history. At the same time, that doesn't mean we can't see progress and we can't see trends over time and so on. That's a very different thing. But we can't rely on that naturalized version. And in one of the books you mentioned, I actually talk about Fukuyama in this way, about the three kinds of historicism that he smuggles into the end of history, which is kind of ironic given the title of the book. There's mechanistic, pedagogic, and organic historicism, absolutely all through that text, which speaks to the time. It speaks to the time of transition, of post-communist transitions, of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is the anniversary of today, the European 9/11, the better one. And I think it's really important that we do firmly get beyond that while using the appropriate material from the past to inspire ourselves to say we can do it in the future. That's the yes, we can. That's the we've got this if we try, but it's the trying that also is really crucial to that. In terms of influence, yes, this has been thoroughgoing. If we see the amount of extremist political parties on far right, far left who have connections to Moscow, if we see the Confucius Institutes, if we see academics who are paid to produce research that is favorable to the Communist Party of China, if we see the seeds of doubt that are sown in various ways through our social and traditional media, through our academic institutions supposed to provide knowledge, and the kind of knowledge they're providing has been skewed in many cases. But also the moral bankruptcy, I think, that you mentioned among certain parts of academia, particularly those enamored with certain postmodern viewpoints and post-structuralist viewpoints, which in response to this conflict manifested themselves as nothing but lazy cynicism and a parasitism upon the liberal societies which they benefit from while doing nothing to contribute to, and criticizing all of that as just a cynical con trick. So I think that is something that we've had quite an issue with in Germany, which I've been prominent in calling out, among others. And I think a time of reckoning has come for some of those people. They are criticized in a way that has been unthinkable, even in the recent past.
The point with postmodern ideas, I think, is very important. Already in 2014, I sort of very clearly saw that Russia has, taken into its armory all the ideas of the postmodern left and started constructing their narratives like, the French postmodernists and post-structuralists in the 70s advised it should be constructed, but with a very evil underpinning behind that. And I think it's also got to do with the fact that postmodern political ideas, they do not aim at certain ends. What I would quote when Hannah Arendt, in her book on revolution, a great book, by the way, criticizes Marx, I think it can be summed up in a sentence that he promises emancipation, liberation, without freedom after that. And I think that's what was the problem with, the postmodern left and the ideas that, Russian polittechnologists, they took to use is exactly, they promised a sort of emancipation from the West, from the Western ideals, but not political freedom, not agency afterwards. And that's, it's very hard sometimes to, put a finger on these things, but I think it really must be stressed that these ideas are also in part, it's sort of Russia, the problem of Russia is in a way, ironically, also kind of our creation, because a lot of the ideas they're using, they're not uniquely Russian ideas. They don't have the intellectual capacity, never had. They are more European and Western ideas, just twisted in a very sinister way.
Yeah, I mean, expansionary imperialism and dictatorship will always find the means they need at the time. And in this case, you're right, it has been very much using those means that were developed in Western academia against us. We think of the political technologists, you said, Gelman in the beginning, Surkov, some of the others, quite well summed up, I think, in Peter Pomerantsev's phrase that the nothing is true and everything is possible. And in Germany, we've had the opposite problem sometimes, that everything is true and nothing is possible, to try too many arguments weighed up over too much time. But I think there's something important to acknowledge about this as well, is that a lot of those postmodern critiques were good in terms of the critique they provided of overblown modernisms in Western societies, hegemonic power formations, etc., which had a negative effect on creativity as well. There were many positive sides to modernism, and modernism across all its forms, but there were downsides too. And in positing those critiques, I think that's still a useful endeavor, and some of the modes of critique are useful. It's the political ends of it, as you rightly mentioned. There are no goals with that. It's follow me to nowhere, which obviously opens a vacuum for those who have more dangerous ideas that they would like to fill that in with. So I think while you can take some of the postmodern approaches to critique, even post-truth, we could talk about saying there are many truths in each situation. How we evaluate them, how we weigh them up, and the criteria we use is extremely important. Simply saying there is only one truth about anything is probably unrealistic, but that was always a caricature as well. So I think getting some balance here between what is useful intellectual critique and then what the political consequences of it are is really important in understanding where is the problem and what to do about it.
And the funny part is that it led to really different approach towards Russia. For example, when you are seeing the world around yourself as postmodernist, you are seeing that as a change and fluctuations and things like that. And while you are Western European in like 2010 or early 2000s, you are seeing Russia like, oh, they should never be something like an issue for Europeans. And well, we can let them in their sandbox. They will play, and even if they are, I don't know, attacking someone with some hand full of sand, that's nothing to worry about for Western Europeans. So I believe the thing how this kind of postmodernist cracked is really different from a few sides, and it connects like into a really strange area where we are having this kind of broken promise of security, and as well broken promise of we are really living in a plural world, and we can allow to some degree to be anyone they want. So yeah, I believe that there's some kind of strange questions we are not really answering about what was the deep beneath this postmodern idea of viewing Russia.
Yeah, I mean, just to say something directly to that, so I think indeed when it's used badly, some of this is incredibly childish, the critiques that you get, saying that, for example, liberalism is not perfectly liberal, therefore why bother? Pointing out all the hypocrisies, all the inconsistencies, without being able to make the necessary political judgment as to what is better and what is worse fundamentally. And I have used Michel Foucault, for example, and Jacques Derrida in my own work as modes of critique. But what I find astonishing is some very smart people in academia take the wrong parts of this stuff and take it too seriously at times. So when Foucault made the comment that it's not that everything is bad, it's that everything is dangerous, take the next step. Say, yes, but everything is not only bad or only dangerous or equally dangerous. Judging between those things is the basic political act in many ways. And that's what I find really, really strange and disappointing, that a lot of academics in politics and in international relations, which is my field, as well as in others, they don't go there and do that. And what I think this robs you of is any sense of ambition, any sense of why you should try and do things, any goal, any fundamental motivating political goal. Because you know everything is imperfect, you don't even bother to try. And I think it's that stealing of motivation that has been probably the most detrimental aspect of this in the West.
Another sort of academical but very influential in international politics, what I would describe as a cynical ideology, and you criticized it a lot, is what's called Neo-realism, and John Mearsheimer and that lot, and what you oppose your Neo-idealism project against. But the funniest thing I found, and people on Twitter already pointed this out, that the most delusional people concerning Russia and China were the so-called realists. They had no idea what the motivations are of these regimes, what they will do to achieve their goals, and what even those goals are. That their goals are not only securitization of their borders. No, it's expansion not only in territorial sense or political sense, but also exporting their ideas, corruption, their influence, and so on. So, but talking about what's neo-realism, is it? You talk to decision makers, and in the corridors around that, are still neo-realists influential?
Is it more like a toy soldier game currently?
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is the greatest trick the IR devil ever pulled was letting realism call itself realism. I mean, what a branding exercise. Who doesn't want to be realistic? I mean, what's the alternative? Being delusional or being seeing things strangely. So the very exercise of calling yourself realist is such a monumentally arrogant thing to do for a start. And it's also really misleading, because they, as much as any others, have a particular view of the world and an idea of how the world should be, which they then impose onto their frameworks. And a lot of people say, and I'm going to upset some of my friends here, so hi to you all out there. A lot of people say it's not realism, it's John Mearsheimer, who's a bad exponent of realism. His conclusions don't work even from his own theory, and anyone who's read his work knows just how terribly thin it is and what a light reading of the world, people, history, etc. it is. But I think the problem goes deeper. I think the problem is not only neo-realism, which takes the structuring principles of anarchy in the world system as its fundamental structure. It's sometimes called structural realism. It goes back to classical realism where the problems are as well. And there's a wonderful book by Matthew Spector, who's also a friend of mine, that I would encourage anyone who wants to understand the history of realism to read. And it's called The Atlantic Realists. And it shows how it really problematizes and debunks the founding myth of realism as being founded basically by the German emigres who came to the US after the Second World War, disillusioned liberals, mugged by reality, who had to get real about the nature of people and about the nature of the world. No, the actual story of realism goes back much further. And obviously, realists in the US draw on Thucydides and so on. They draw principles from Machiavelli. But if we're talking about the real foundation of a habitus, an approach to the world, a way of seeing as realism, it goes back to the 1890s and to the conversations between German and American geopoliticians. So Alfred Teilhard, someone who we know from founding geopolitics, Friedrich Ratzel, then through people like Karl Haushofer, Carl Schmitt, who you may have come across for other reasons, but also Isaiah Bowman from the Council on Foreign Relations, who was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson at various times. What Matt Spector has done is to really chart the conversations between these people, the ways they were writing, and show that realism as this way of seeing the world comes out of a moment where two countries, the US and Germany, wanted to elevate themselves to the highest level of world powers. This, running through it, is an authorization of imperialism and a chauvinism towards people in smaller states in particular. There's a racist chauvinism baked into some of the earlier stuff too. The Nazi geopolitics, that's obvious. Race and space often came together. But even in the American version, think about the conference, the peace treaty at Versailles and the peace conference, and how that relied on racial tropes, racial mapping, etc. But also really about who was capable of managing the world and who wasn't, which races were and which weren't, and how realism gave a lot of people in both countries the idea that they should be authorized to take on this role of Weltmacht and Weltpolitik. And it's a very interesting history that I think no one I've come across working in the realist tradition now has been able to properly deal with. There are better and worse realist scholars, but I think that's a problem that haunts the whole tradition. And again, allowing them to get away with calling themselves realist is something we shouldn't do.
Last point I would like to discuss, adding to the history of realism, I think there's also, especially if you would read what Russian diplomats, I think the grandson of Molotov, who was, of course, famous for his treaty with the Nazi Ribbentrop, he wrote an article, I think maybe in 2005 or something like that, where he talked that we want to return to the great game. Talking, of course, about the relationship, tense relationship between, in the second half of the 19th century, between Russia and Great Britain, and the geopolitics that were on the borders with Afghanistan and so on. All those things, that the idea was that we belong at the big boys table, but the idea that there should be a big boys table is, for the most part, if you ask anyone between Helsinki and, I don't know, Ljubljana, everyone say, you got to be bonkers.
Right, and it is bonkers because this exactly right, as you put it, and we've seen the consequences of that type of thinking in Ukraine, in letting Russia get away with thinking it could have a sphere of influence where it can act on others as it wishes. And when you combine that with an expansionary mindset going all the way back to Catherine the Great saying, I know no way to defend my borders other than to extend my borders, you see what recipe for disaster you've saved up there. Now, in terms of does realism of this kind matter in the halls of power? Well, I think it's more the understanding that people want to be realistic, first of all, which is not the same thing, as we've said. But second, the understanding that power does matter in the world. But we shouldn't, again, give realists the credit of saying they're the only ones who get that. The rest of us get that too, in quite a substantive way. And I mean, certainly neoconservatives would certainly have an argument with them saying, yeah, we think power can be used for good as well. And neo-idealists in a different way would as well. So I think that's really important to understand the modes of power we have at our disposal and how they actually stack up against each other. And that's not just hard power, soft power, transformative power, although those matter. It's also our ordering power as democracies. And this is where the point you made from Helsinki to Ljubljana, and I would add across the Western world, should be better realized. Sometimes we doubt ourselves too much. That group of countries, the democracies of the world, have significant power to order the world if we choose to seize it and if we are more confident with ourselves rather than doubting ourselves. There's some reason to be critical of our pasts. Colonial histories need dealing with wherever they are, but that's no reason to handicap our futures and to make sure that we make the future worse than it could be otherwise. The other part is, how do we then go about democratic ordering that sees an order for smaller states, that benefits smaller states, as being in the interest of all democratic states? And that's why I would encourage democracies to see the world like smaller states. This is in your interest. It's much like in our societies, we have social safety nets. We want people to come with us who are like us. We want people who share our values to do well, because we all do better by doing that. And that's the same thing to a certain extent in international society. So this is a big challenge to those other realists at the moment, the Restraint Coalition around the Quincy Institute in the US and elsewhere, who see no good use for our power. I put that straight back to them and said, we have to put our power to good use, or we will face someone else's power that is far worse.
Ben, thank you so much for this discussion. It was amazing. I'll just remind our listeners that this evening we were talking with Dr. Benjamin Tallis and Dovydas Karolskis. I'm Laurynas Peluritis. I was the moderator of this discussion. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for coming to Vilnius again.
Yeah, that was great. And I hope that our listeners will follow you on Twitter for forthcoming information about everything we are talking about.
If I get it right, I'd say Achu. Thank you both very much. I really loved the conversation as well. I'm hoping to come back to Vilnius a lot more, hoping to meet more of your listeners at various times. Yeah, and so do be in touch.